The fluorescent lights of the family court waiting room buzzed like dying insects, casting sickly shadows across my trembling hands. 3 months ago, I had been Akira Tanaka, devoted wife and mother of 7-year-old Yuki. Today, I sat here, as a woman stripped of everything I had ever held sacred, clutching a manila folder that contained what remained of my shattered life. My husband Hiroshi had done more than file for divorce. He had systematically destroyed my reputation, my credibility, and my maternal rights with the precision of a corporate executive dismantling a failing subsidiary. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same calculating mind that had once made me fall in love with him was now being used to erase me from existence. Unfit mother. The papers read, emotionally unstable, history of erratic behavior, potential danger to the child's psychological development. Each accusation felt like a blade sliding between my ribs, finding spaces I didn't know existed. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves, but how expertly they had been crafted from fragments of truth. That breakdown I'd had after my mother's death 2 years ago, when grief had consumed me for 3 weeks. The antidepressants I'd taken for 6 months afterward. The single instance when I'd raised my voice at Yuki during a particularly difficult bedtime routine. All of it twisted, recontextualized, weaponized. Across the hallway, Hiroshi sat with his legal team, a fortress of expensive suits and briefcases. At the center of this formation was Kenji Watanabe, the most ruthless family law attorney in Tokyo. Hiroshi had chosen him not just for his reputation, but for his particular specialty in destroying mothers who dared to fight for custody. Watanabe was known for his ability to make loving mothers appear dangerous. Devoted wives seemed mentally unstable. He crafted narratives so compelling that judges found themselves nodding along to the systematic character assassination of women, whose only crime was trusting the wrong man. I watched Hiroshi lean over to whisper something to Watanabe, and both men glanced in my direction before sharing what appeared to be an amused exchange. The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn. This was the man who had once promised to protect me from the world's harshness. Now he was orchestrating its most brutal assault. The preliminary hearing had been a massacre. My court-appointed attorney, a well-meaning but overwhelmed public defender named Suzuki, had been systematically outmaneuvered at every turn. Watanabe presented a mountain of evidence. Witness statements from neighbors who claimed to have seen me acting strangely. Medical records that painted my brief treatment for depression as ongoing mental instability. Even security footage from our apartment building that supposedly showed me behaving erratically with Yuki. I barely recognized the woman they described. According to their narrative, I was a volatile, unpredictable person who had somehow managed to fool everyone for years. My friends, my family, even myself, apparently. The judge, an older man with kind eyes that had turned increasingly cold, as Watanabe spoke, granted Hiroshi temporary full custody with supervised visitation rights for me. 2 hours a week, under the watchful eye of a court-appointed monitor, to see my own son. That night, I sat in my empty apartment. Hiroshi had somehow secured the right to remain in our family home for Yuki's stability, and contemplated how completely I had been erased. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my place in the world had been revealed as an elaborate fiction. Hiroshi hadn't just decided he wanted a divorce. He had been planning this systematic destruction for months, possibly years. But sitting in that sterile waiting room, watching my husband's legal team prepare for what they assumed would be my final defeat, I felt something other than despair beginning to take shape in my chest. It was cold and sharp and patient. It was the first truly clear thought I'd had in months. If Hiroshi wanted to play games with the truth, perhaps I should learn the rules. The revelation came 3 weeks later. In the most mundane of circumstances, I had been researching Watanabe's previous cases, trying to understand his strategies so I could somehow prepare for our next hearing. The law library at Tokyo University was quiet except for the soft whisper of turning pages and the occasional cough from fellow researchers. I was reading through case files when I noticed something odd in the pattern of Watanabe's victories. Many of his most devastating wins involved cases where the opposing party had been represented by attorneys from the same large firm where Watanabe had worked before going independent. Initially, I assumed this was simply evidence of his superiority over his former colleagues. But as I dug deeper, a more disturbing picture emerged. These weren't battles between opposing forces. They were orchestrated performances. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Watanabe maintained a private investigator on retainer, a man named Ishida who specialized in what he euphemistically called domestic intelligence gathering. Ishida's methods were questionable, but not technically illegal. He cultivated relationships with building superintendents, befriended lonely neighbors, even occasionally posed as deliverymen or repair workers to gain access to information about his targets. More importantly, Ishida had a particular talent for identifying women who were emotionally vulnerable, financially dependent, or socially isolated, perfect candidates for the kind of systematic character assassination that was Watanabe's specialty. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Watanabe didn't just win cases. He selected them. He chose battles he knew he could win because he had already gathered the ammunition needed to destroy his opponents. But there was something else. Something that made my hands shake as I held the photocopied documents I had somehow managed to obtain through a sympathetic law librarian whose ex-husband had been one of Watanabe's victims. Ishida's reports weren't just about the women he was investigating. They were about their husbands too. Comprehensive profiles that included financial records, communication patterns, and detailed psychological assessments. The implication was staggering. Watanabe wasn't just representing men in custody battles. He was identifying which men would be most likely to initiate them, then cultivating those relationships months or even years before any legal action began. He was manufacturing cases, creating the very conflicts he would later profit from resolving. And there, in a file marked with my married name, was evidence that my entire marriage had been under surveillance for over 2 years. Ishida had detailed reports on my daily routines, my friendships, my relationship with my mother before her death, even my grocery shopping habits. They knew about my brief struggle with depression before I did. They had documented the exact circumstances they would later twist into evidence of my unfitness as a mother. Most devastatingly, they had a complete psychological profile of Hiroshi, including his tendency toward emotional manipulation, his deep-seated resentment of financial dependence, and his specific triggers for feeling emasculated. The report concluded with a recommendation that he would be an ideal candidate for a strategic custody acquisition, legal terminology that made my blood run cold. My husband hadn't simply decided he wanted to destroy me. He had been carefully guided into that decision by people who stood to profit from our family's destruction. Our marriage hadn't failed. It had been murdered for money. That night, I called the number listed for Ishida's business. A gravelly voice answered after 3 rings. "I know what you've been doing," I said without preamble. "I know about the surveillance, reports, the manufactured evidence, the systematic targeting of vulnerable women. I know about Watanabe's real business model." There was a long pause. Then, "Who is this?" "Someone who's going to expose you unless you help me understand exactly how this works. I have copies of your reports, Ishida, including the ones that show you've been targeting women who never did anything wrong except trust the wrong people. Another pause, longer this time. "What do you want?" "I want to know how to beat you at your own game." The meeting took place in a small cafe in Shibuya, the kind of anonymous space where salary workers grabbed quick meals between endless meetings. Ishida was exactly what I had expected. A thin man in his 50s with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades observing without being observed. His eyes had the flat quality of a person who had made peace with moral compromises long ago. "You're making a mistake," he said, stirring sugar into coffee with mechanical precision. "You can't win against Watanabe in court. I've seen him destroy women with much better resources than you have. Then help me destroy him outside of court." He looked up sharply. "That's not how this works. I gather information. I don't wage wars." "You've been waging war against innocent women for years," I replied. "The only difference is whether you're honest about it." He was quiet for a long time, studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a complex document. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Watanabe has a weakness," he said. "He's successful because he's thorough. But thorough people leave trails. And sometimes those trails lead to places they'd rather not have examined." "What kind of places?" "The kind where a man who makes his living destroying marriages might not want his own personal life scrutinized too closely." Over the next hour, Ishida painted a picture of Watanabe that was both more complex and more disturbing than I had imagined. The attorney's success wasn't just built on strategic character assassination. It was built on genuine psychopathy. He didn't just represent men who wanted to destroy their wives. He actively cultivated those desires. His client consultations were elaborate psychological manipulation sessions, designed to transform marital dissatisfaction into murderous rage. But more importantly, Watanabe's personal life was a carefully constructed facade hiding behaviors that would destroy his career if they became public. He had a wife, Miyuki, a former client who had been so systematically broken down during her own custody battle that she had essentially become his property. Their marriage was less a relationship than an ongoing demonstration of his power to completely control another human being. "She's not happy," Ishida said, his voice carrying the first hint of genuine emotion I'd heard from him. "But she's terrified. He's convinced her that if she ever tries to leave, he'll destroy her just like he's destroyed every other woman who's crossed him. And given his track record, she has every reason to believe him. You feel sorry for her. I feel sorry for all of them. The women he destroys, the children who get caught in the crossfire, even the men who think they're winning when they hire him. He doesn't solve problems. He creates worse ones. But he's very good at making people believe they need him. So how do I beat him?" Ishida was quiet for another long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Not his own. This one belonged to a woman named Rei Nakamura, identified as an investigative journalist specializing in legal corruption. "There's been talk for years about doing an expose on the family court system," he said, "about attorneys who manipulate the process for profit, judges who can be influenced, investigators who cross ethical lines. No one's been willing to go on record because the retaliation is too severe. But if someone had enough evidence, enough documentation, enough proof of systematic abuse, you testify. I'd provide evidence. There's a difference." I took the card, feeling its weight like a promise. "What about Miyuki? Would she talk?" "That," Ishida said, "standing to leave would depend on whether someone could convince her that there was actually a way to escape. She's been trapped for so long. I'm not sure she remembers what freedom looks like." That night, I began planning not just my legal defense, but my complete transformation. If Hiroshi and Watanabe thought they could destroy me by controlling the narrative, I would show them what happened when someone rewrote the entire story. The next morning, I called Rei Nakamura. "I need to tell you about the family court industrial complex," I said when she answered. "And I have evidence." The investigation took 3 months. Rei was exactly the kind of journalist I had hoped to find, thorough, fearless, and personally motivated by a system she had watched destroy too many innocent people. She had been working on this story for 2 years, but had never found someone willing to provide the level of access and documentation needed to make it bulletproof. I became her primary source, but I also became something more strategic. I became the perfect victim whose case would illustrate the entire corrupt system. My story had everything: a successful, loving mother destroyed by manufactured evidence, a calculating attorney who treated human misery as a profitable commodity, a private investigator who specialized in psychological warfare, and a system that rewarded cruelty while punishing honesty. But the most important element was Miyuki Watanabe. Convincing her to speak with Rei required months of careful relationship building. I started by attending the same yoga classes she frequented, gradually building the kind of casual acquaintanceship that would allow for deeper conversations. She was exactly what Ishida had described, a woman so thoroughly broken that she had forgotten how to imagine alternatives to her situation. The breakthrough came when I mentioned, in passing, that I was going through a custody battle. The flash of recognition and sympathy in her eyes was unmistakable. Here was someone who understood the specific kind of destruction I was experiencing. "My husband represents men in cases like yours," she said quietly after class one day. "I've seen what it does to the women involved. I'm sorry you're going through that. What kind of men does he represent?" I asked, careful to sound curious rather than calculating. "Men who want to win at any cost," she replied. "Men who care more about destroying their ex-wives than protecting their children. It's very profitable." Over the following weeks, our conversations became more candid. Miyuki was starved for genuine human connection. Isolated by a husband who had systematically severed her relationships with friends and family, I became the first person in years who listened to her without judgment, who saw her as more than just an extension of her husband's will. The day she agreed to speak with Rei, she was trembling so violently she could barely hold her coffee cup. "He'll destroy me if he finds out," she whispered. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand exactly what he's capable of," I replied. "That's why we have to stop him." The article was published on a Thursday morning in one of Tokyo's most respected investigative journals. The headline read, "The Family Court Predators: How Attorneys Manufacture Custody Wars for Profit." The accompanying photograph showed Watanabe leaving the courthouse after one of his victories, briefcase in hand, while in the background a woman sat crying on a bench with a small child. The story was devastating in its thoroughness. Rei had documented not just my case, but dozens of others that followed the same pattern. She had interviewed former employees of Watanabe's firm, who described a systematic approach to client development that involved identifying and then manipulating men's insecurities until they became weapons against their families. She had obtained financial records showing the extraordinary profits generated by cases that dragged on for years, bleeding families dry while generating massive legal fees. Most damaging were the recorded conversations. Miyuki had been wearing a wire for our last month of investigation, capturing her husband's casual discussions of his clients' cases. In one particularly chilling exchange, Watanabe could be heard laughing about a woman who had attempted suicide after losing custody of her children, referring to her as another successful outcome. But the revelation that destroyed him wasn't professional, it was personal. The recordings revealed that Watanabe's own marriage was maintained through systematic psychological abuse, threats, and legal intimidation. He had used his knowledge of the family court system to create a prison for his own wife, threatening to destroy her if she ever tried to leave while simultaneously making her financially and emotionally dependent on his approval. The legal community reacted with the swift brutality that only comes when someone has finally gone too far. Watanabe's license was suspended pending investigation. His clients began fleeing to other attorneys. His firm's other partners publicly distanced themselves from his methods. Within a week, he had gone from being one of Tokyo's most feared family law attorneys to a professional pariah. For Hiroshi, the collapse was even more complete. The article didn't just expose Watanabe's methods. It revealed how thoroughly my husband had been manipulated into destroying his own family. The psychological profiles that had been used to identify him as a suitable candidate were published in full, showing him to be not a calculating mastermind, but a weak man whose insecurities had been expertly exploited. The revelation shattered the narrative he had constructed about our marriage. Suddenly, I wasn't the unstable ex-wife who had been rightfully separated from her child. I was a victim of an elaborate conspiracy. A loving mother who had been systematically destroyed by people who profited from family misery. The evidence that had been used against me was revealed as manufactured. The witnesses who had testified to my instability were exposed as paid actors, and the very foundation of the custody case crumbled. But the most profound change was in Yuki, my 7-year-old son, who had been living with his father and slowly being poisoned against me. Through carefully constructed lies, suddenly understood that his mother hadn't abandoned him. I hadn't chosen to see him only 2 hours a week. I had been fighting a war for the right to be his parent, and I had been losing because the game was rigged from the beginning. The custody reversal hearing was nothing like the original proceeding. This time, Hiroshi sat alone at the defendant's table, his expensive legal team having abandoned him when the retainer checks stopped clearing. Watanabe was facing his own legal troubles and couldn't represent anyone. The judge who heard the case was a different man entirely. Someone who had read Ray's article and understood exactly what kind of systematic abuse had been perpetrated against our family. Mrs. Tanaka, he said, looking directly at me with eyes that held genuine sympathy. The court owes you an apology. You were the victim of a coordinated effort to manipulate our legal system for profit. The evidence presented against you was fabricated. The witnesses were compromised, and the entire proceeding was tainted by professional misconduct of the most serious kind. Yuki came home with me that afternoon. As we walked up the stairs to our apartment, I had fought to keep it during the divorce proceedings, one of the few battles I had won. He slipped his small hand into mine. "Mama," he said quietly, "I knew something was wrong. I knew you wouldn't just leave me." "I never left you," I replied, squeezing his hand. "I was just fighting very hard to come back to you." That evening, as Yuki slept in his own bed for the first time in 8 months, I stood by his window looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed with a text message from Miyuki. "Thank you for showing me that escape was possible. I filed for divorce today." Another message. This one from Ray. "The story has been picked up by national media. 3 more attorneys are under investigation. You started something important." But the message that meant the most came from my son's teacher. Yuki wrote in his journal today that his mama is a superhero because she fought monsters to save their family. I thought you should know. I had begun this journey as a woman who had lost everything to forces she didn't understand. I had been systematically stripped of my identity, my credibility, my parental rights, and my sense of reality. Men who saw women and children as profitable commodities had tried to erase me from existence. But I had learned something they hadn't counted on. When you take everything from someone, you also free them from the fear of losing anything. When you destroy someone's faith in the system, you create someone who has nothing left to lose by fighting back. When you try to erase a mother's love, you discover that some forces are too powerful to be manufactured, manipulated, or destroyed. The legal settlement from Watanabe's firm was substantial, but the money wasn't the victory. The victory was in the dozens of other women who reached out after reading the article. Women who had been living with the same manufactured shame and self-doubt. That had almost destroyed me. The victory was in the policy changes that began rippling through the family court system, as judges and administrators realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated. The victory was in Yuki's laugh when he realized he could trust his own memories of our relationship instead of the lies he had been told. It was in Miyuki's voice when she called to tell me she had won her freedom. It was in the knowledge that sometimes, when the system is completely corrupt, the only way to fix it is to burn it down and build something better from the ashes. Hiroshi tried to reconcile 3 months later. He came to our apartment with flowers and tears, claiming he had been manipulated. that he had never wanted to hurt me, that he just wanted his family back. He looked genuinely broken. A man who had realized too late that he had destroyed the best thing in his life for the approval of people who saw him as nothing more than a revenue stream. I listened to his entire speech standing in the doorway, not inviting him inside. When he finished, I spoke calmly and clearly. You didn't just choose to divorce me, Hiroshi. You chose to try to destroy me. You chose to take my child away from me. You chose to let strangers dissect my mental health and twist my love for our son into evidence of my unfitness. Those weren't things that happened to you. They were choices you made. But I was manipulated. He protested. They used my insecurities against me. They made me believe things that weren't true. They couldn't have manipulated you into destroying me. If some part of you hadn't wanted to destroy me already, I replied, they didn't create your cruelty. They just gave you permission to express it. I closed the door gently but firmly through the peephole. I watched him stand there for several minutes before finally walking away. It was the last time I saw him. 6 months later, I received an invitation to speak at a legal conference about systematic abuse in family court proceedings. The letter was signed by a coalition of family law attorneys, social workers, and child advocates who were working to reform the system. They wanted me to tell my story not as a victim, but as someone who had found a way to fight back. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience filled with legal professionals who had the power to protect or destroy families. I felt the weight of every woman who had been silenced by shame, every child who had been used as a weapon, every family that had been sacrificed for profit. The system failed me. I began, not because it was broken, but because it was working. Exactly as designed. It was designed to be profitable, not just. It was designed to create conflict, not resolve it. It was designed to benefit the people who worked within it, not the families it claimed to serve. But here's what the people who tried to destroy my family didn't understand. When you take everything from Mother, you don't make her weak. You make her dangerous. When you separate a woman from her child for profit, you don't create a victim. You create an enemy. And when you build your success on the systematic destruction of innocent people, you eventually encounter someone who refuses to be destroyed. The applause was sustained and emotional. Afterward, dozens of people approached me, attorneys, who wanted to learn how to better protect their clients, social workers who had seen too many families destroyed by the system they served, mothers who were fighting their own battles against manufactured evidence and coordinated character assassination. But the conversation that stayed with me was with a young attorney named Sarah, barely out of law school, who was starting her career in family law. How do you rebuild trust in the system after something like this? She asked. How do you have faith in justice when you've seen how completely it can be corrupted? I thought about her question for a long time before answering. You don't rebuild trust in the system, I finally said. You build something better. You become the kind of attorney who puts children's welfare above profit margins. You become the kind of professional who sees families as human beings, not revenue streams. You remember that behind every case file is a child who just wants their parents to stop hurting each other. The system didn't save me. I continued. People saved me. Individual people who chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult or dangerous. Ishida, who risked his career to provide evidence. Ray, who spent months investigating a story that powerful people didn't want told. Miyuki, who found the courage to speak truth to power even when it meant risking everything. Even my son's teacher, who saw through the lies and reminded me that children know love when they experience it. The system is just a collection of individual choices made by individual people. If you want to fix it, you start by choosing to be the kind of person who puts justice above convenience, truth above profit, and human dignity above professional advancement. That night, driving home to where Yuki was waiting with homework questions and stories about his day, I reflected on the year that had changed everything. I had started as a woman who believed that good people were protected by just systems, that following the rules and telling the truth were sufficient to ensure fairness. I had learned that systems are only as good as the people who operate them, and that some people will always choose profit over justice, power over compassion, victory over truth. But I had also learned that there are others who will choose differently, who will risk their own security to protect strangers, who will speak truth even when it's dangerous. Most importantly, I had learned that love is not passive. Protecting the people you care about sometimes requires more than good intentions. It requires strategic thinking, careful planning, and the willingness to fight battles you never wanted to fight. It requires recognizing that there are people in the world who will try to destroy you for profit, and developing the skills needed to defeat them. As I pulled into our parking space, I saw Yuki's face in the window, watching for my return. He waved excitedly, then disappeared, probably running to the door to meet me. This simple moment, coming home to my child after a day of work, being greeted with uncomplicated joy and trust, was worth every battle I had fought to preserve. The apartment was warm with the smell of the dinner Yuki had attempted to prepare as a surprise. It was somewhat burned and definitely nutritionally questionable, but it was made with love by a child who felt secure enough in his relationship with his mother to want to take care of her in return. "How was your speech, Mama?" he asked as we ate his creation. "It was good," I replied. "I told people about how we fought the monsters and won. Are there still monsters out there?" I considered lying, giving him the comfortable fiction that bad people had been defeated and good people were safe. Forever. But Yuki had already seen too much of the world's complexity to believe in simple stories. "Yes," I said, "there are still monsters. But there are also people who fight monsters. And sometimes, when you fight hard enough and smart enough and long enough, you win." He nodded seriously, processing this information with the gravity of a child who had learned that adults sometimes lie about important things. "Will you teach me how to fight monsters?" he asked. "I'll teach you how to recognize them," I replied. "And I'll teach you that you're never as powerless as they want you to believe. And most importantly, I'll teach you that the people who love you will fight to protect you, even when the whole world seems to be against you." Later that evening, after Yuki had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the latest message from Ray. Her article had sparked a broader investigation into corruption in the family court system. 3 judges were under review, 7 attorneys had been sanctioned, and new oversight procedures were being implemented to prevent the kind of systematic abuse my family had endured. But the message that meant the most was from a woman named Keiko, whose custody case was being handled by one of the attorneys inspired by my story to change his approach to family law. Her ex-husband had hired Watanabe's former associate, expecting the same systematic character assassination that had been used against me. Instead, he found himself facing an attorney who prioritized the children's welfare over billable hours, who sought resolution rather than destruction. "I wanted you to know," Keiko wrote, "that your fight didn't just save your own family. It saved mine too. My daughter gets to keep her mother because you refused to let them erase you." I finished my tea and prepared for bed, but before turning off the lights, I stood in Yuki's doorway watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, unmarked by the anxiety and confusion that had shadowed it during the months when he hadn't understood why his world was falling apart. He looked like a child who felt safe, loved, and protected. The woman who had begun this journey would never have imagined herself capable of the strategic thinking, the emotional resilience, or the sheer stubborn determination that had been required to save her family. She had been naive about the world's capacity for cruelty, unprepared for the reality that some people would destroy children's lives for money. But perhaps that innocence had been necessary. Perhaps someone who had understood from the beginning how completely the system could be corrupted would have been too intimidated to fight back. Perhaps it took someone who still believed in justice to be willing to fight for it when it was. Denied that the revenge I had taken wasn't violent or crude. It was precise, surgical, and permanent. I had identified the source of the corruption that had nearly destroyed my family, documented its methods, exposed its operations, and dismantled its power structure. But more than that, I had created systemic changes that would protect other families from experiencing what we had endured. Watanabe's career was over. His personal life was in ruins, and his methods had been exposed as the cruel manipulation they had always been. Hiroshi had lost not just his family, but his reputation and his self-respect. The system that had enabled their cruelty was being reformed by people who now understood how thoroughly it had been corrupted. But the real victory wasn't in their destruction. It was in the preservation of love itself. Despite months of systematic attempts to poison my relationship with my son, despite professional efforts to convince him that his mother was dangerous and unstable, despite a coordinated campaign to erase me from his life, Yuki had never stopped loving me. He had never stopped believing, somewhere deep in his 7-year-old heart, that his mother would find a way back to him. That love had been strong enough to survive professional psychological manipulation. It had been resilient enough to withstand legal warfare. It had been pure enough to cut through manufactured lies and artificial evidence. In the end, it had been the one thing they couldn't corrupt, couldn't destroy, couldn't purchase or manipulate or twist into something ugly. They had underestimated the power of a mother's love to inspire strategic thinking. They had miscalculated the fury of a woman who discovers that her child has been used as a weapon against her. They had failed to anticipate the determination of someone who has lost everything except the will to fight back. Most fatally, they had assumed that destroying someone's faith in the system would make them give up, when in reality, it had freed me to fight outside the system's rules. When you no longer believe that following proper procedures will lead to just outcomes, you become willing to pursue justice through other means. I had claimed I was unfit to be a mother, so I had become something he couldn't fight, a woman who understood exactly how the game was rigged and was willing to use that knowledge to destroy the players who had tried to destroy her family. As I finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, I smiled at the irony. Hiroshi had been right about one thing. I wasn't the same woman he had married. The woman he had married would never have been capable of the calculated campaign I had waged against him and his allies. But then again, the woman he had married would never have needed to be. The months following the conference were a whirlwind of activity as the ripple effects of our victory continued to spread. The legal reforms sparked by Ray's article gained momentum, with Japan's family court system implementing mandatory training for judges on recognizing manufactured evidence and psychological manipulation. I was invited to contribute to the curriculum, drawing on my experience to create case studies that would help judicial officials identify and counteract corrupt practices. At the same time, I began receiving letters and calls from women across Japan and beyond, each sharing stories of their own battles against similar tactics. One letter from a woman named Eiko in Osaka stood out. She described how her ex-husband's attorney had used falsified medical records to paint her as an unfit mother, costing her custody of her two sons. Inspired by my story, she had begun gathering evidence of her own and was preparing to appeal her case. "You showed me that I'm not powerless," she wrote. "I thought I was alone, but now I know there are others fighting the same fight." Aiko's letter prompted me to establish a support network for survivors of family court abuse. With Ray's help, we created an online platform where women could share their experiences, access legal resources, and connect with attorneys who had committed to ethical family law practices. The platform, called Mothers Unearthed, quickly grew into a community of thousands, a testament to how widespread the problem had been and how desperate people were for change. Meanwhile, Yuki was adjusting to life back home, but the scars of our separation lingered. He had nightmares about being taken away again, and I noticed him watching me carefully, as if checking to make sure I was still the mother he remembered. We began family therapy with a counselor who specialized in children affected by custody disputes. Dr. Hayashi helped Yuki process the confusion and fear that had been instilled by the lies he had been told, guiding us toward rebuilding a relationship grounded in trust and open communication. One evening, during a therapy session, Yuki asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mama, why did Papa believe those bad things about you? Did he really think you weren't a good mom?" I looked at Dr. Hayashi, who gave me a small nod, encouraging me to answer honestly but carefully. "Your Papa was going through a hard time," I said, choosing my words with care. "Someone very good at manipulating people made him believe things that weren't true. They used his fears and insecurities to make him think that hurting me was the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean he didn't love you or that he doesn't regret what happened." "Does he regret it?" Yuki asked, his voice small but searching. "I think he does," I replied. "But sometimes regret isn't enough to fix what's been broken. That's why we're focusing on you and me now, on making sure you feel safe and loved." Yuki nodded, processing this. Dr. Hayashi suggested we create a safe space ritual at home, a daily moment where Yuki could share any worries or questions without fear of judgment. We started ending each day with a cup of hot chocolate and 10 minutes of talking about anything on his mind, from school to his favorite manga to the lingering fears from our time apart. Those moments became our anchor, a reminder that our bond was stronger than the forces that had tried to tear it apart. Miyuki Watanabe's divorce proceedings became another focal point of my attention. Her case was complex, as Kenji had used his legal expertise to entangle her finances and personal life in ways that made escape seem impossible. I connected her with a pro bono attorney from the Mothers Unearthed network, a woman named Hana Sato who had a reputation for taking on challenging cases. Together, we helped Miyuki navigate the legal maze, securing her financial independence and ensuring that Kenji's threats could no longer hold her hostage. When Miyuki's divorce was finalized, she invited me to celebrate at a small restaurant near her new apartment. Over steak and grilled fish, she shared her plans to enroll in a counseling program to help other women escape abusive relationships. "You gave me back my life," she said, raising her glass. "I want to do the same for others." "You're already doing it," I replied. "Every time you tell your story, you show someone else that freedom is possible." The broader investigation into family court corruption continued to uncover shocking details. Ray's reporting revealed that Watanabe hadn't acted alone. He was part of a loose network of attorneys and investigators who shared strategies for manipulating custody cases. This discovery led to a task force led by Detective Morimoto, a tenacious officer who had taken a personal interest in dismantling the family court industrial complex, as Ray had dubbed it. I was asked to consult on the task force, providing insights into the psychological and legal tactics used by attorneys like Watanabe. The work was grueling, requiring me to revisit the pain of my own experience while analyzing case files from dozens of other families. But it was also empowering, as each new piece of evidence brought us closer to dismantling the system that had enabled such widespread abuse. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when we uncovered a digital archive of training materials used by Watanabe and his associates. The archive included detailed manuals on how to identify profitable clients, how to manufacture evidence of parental unfitness, and how to manipulate judicial biases to secure favorable rulings. The documents were a chilling blueprint for psychological warfare, and their discovery led to the suspension of 5 additional attorneys and the indictment of 2 private investigators. As the task force's work gained traction, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker named Emiko Yamada, who wanted to tell the story of our fight against family court corruption. The documentary, titled Unseen Wounds, would weave together my story with those of other mothers who had survived similar ordeals, highlighting the systemic issues and the human cost of legal manipulation. I agreed to participate, not for personal recognition, but because I believed the film could amplify our message and push for broader reforms. Filming was an emotional process, revisiting the darkest moments of my life standing in that courtroom, hearing the judge declare me unfit. Seeing Yuki's confused face during our supervised visits required a level of vulnerability I hadn't anticipated, but it was worth it when I saw the rough cut of the documentary. Emiko had captured not just the pain, but the resilience, the determination, and the love that had carried us through. The film premiered at a human rights festival in Kyoto, receiving a standing ovation and sparking international interest in family court reform. The documentary's impact was immediate. It was picked up by a major streaming platform, reaching audiences in over 50 countries. Letters poured in from parents around the world, sharing their own stories of custody battles, tainted by manipulation and corruption. The Mothers Annaris platform expanded to include international members, creating a global network of survivors and advocates working to change family court systems in their own countries. 2 years after the documentary's release, I was invited to testify before a parliamentary committee in Tokyo, tasked with overhauling Japan's family law system. The committee was considering legislation that would mandate independent oversight of custody. Cases require transparency in evidence collection and establish penalties for attorneys who engaged in unethical practices. My testimony focused on the human cost of the current system, using my story and those of other mothers to illustrate the urgent need for reform. Children are not commodities, I told the committee. They are not pawns to be used in legal games for profit. Every time a parent is unjustly separated from their child, we create wounds that may never fully heal. We must build a system that prioritizes the welfare of families over the financial interests of those who exploit them. The legislation passed with overwhelming support, a testament to the power of collective voices and the undeniable truth of our stories. The new laws included provisions for free legal aid for low-income parents, mandatory training for judges on recognizing manipulation tactics, and a national registry to track attorneys with a history of unethical behavior. As the reforms took effect, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. The woman who had sat in that family court waiting room, trembling under the weight of false accusations, had become someone who could stand before lawmakers and demand change. The mother who had nearly lost her son had become an advocate for thousands of others. The wife who had been betrayed had become a force for justice, not just for herself, but for families she would never meet. Yuki, now 10, was growing into a thoughtful and resilient young boy. He had taken an interest in writing, filling notebooks with stories about heroes who battled monsters to protect their loved ones. One evening, he showed me a story he had written for school, titled The Superhero Mom. It was a fictionalized account of our journey, with me as a caped crusader fighting a shadowy organization that stole children from their parents. "You made me a superhero," I said, laughing as I read the story. "You are a superhero," he replied, his eyes serious. "You fought the bad guys and saved me. That's what superheroes do." I hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his trust and love. "I had a pretty great sidekick," I said. "You kept believing in me, even when things were really hard." That made me strong enough to keep fighting. As Yuki grew, so did our bond. We continued our hot chocolate ritual, using it as a time to talk about his dreams, his fears, and his questions about the world. He asked about his father occasionally, and I arranged for supervised visits with Hiroshi, who had moved to a new city and was working to rebuild his life. The visits were carefully structured to ensure Yuki's emotional safety, and over time, Hiroshi proved he could be a positive presence, even if our trust in him remained fragile. Miyuki became a regular part of our lives, often joining us for dinner or outings to the park. Her counseling training was progressing, and she had started working with a local shelter for domestic abuse survivors. Her strength and compassion inspired me, a reminder that survival was not just about escaping pain, but about using that pain to create something meaningful. Rei Nakamura continued her investigative work, publishing a follow-up article that exposed additional layers of corruption in the family court system. Her reporting led to the establishment of a national task force dedicated to ongoing oversight and reform. With me serving as an advisor, the task force's work was slow but steady, uncovering new cases of abuse and implementing protections to prevent them from happening again. One of the most unexpected developments came 3 years after Watanabe's downfall, when I received a call from a producer in Tokyo. They were interested in adapting Unseen Wounds into a scripted television series, with the goal of reaching an even wider audience. The series would fictionalize elements of our stories to protect privacy, but remain true to the emotional and systemic realities we had faced. Working on the series was a new kind of challenge. I served as a consultant, ensuring the scripts captured the psychological complexity of our experiences and the broader implications for family court reform. The show, titled Shades of Truth, premiered to critical acclaim and became a cultural touchstone in Japan, sparking conversations about the intersection of law, psychology, and family dynamics. The success of Shades of Truth led to invitations to speak at international conferences on family law reform. I traveled to London, New York, and Sydney, sharing our story and advocating for global changes to protect families from legal manipulation. Each conference was a reminder of how far-reaching the problem was and how universal the desire for justice and healing. Back home, Yuki was thriving in middle school, his creativity and confidence growing with each passing year. He had started a school club for young writers, encouraging his peers to tell their own stories. At one of their events, he read a poem he had written about our journey, titled The Unbreakable Thread. It described the invisible bond between us, a thread that had held strong through lies, separation, and pain. As I listened to him read, tears welled in my eyes. The boy who had once been manipulated into doubting his mother's love had grown into someone who could articulate its strength with clarity and grace. His poem ended with a line that stayed with me. No monster can break what love has made. That night, as we walked home under a sky full of stars, I asked Yuki what he wanted to be when he grew up. I want to tell stories that help people, he said. Like you do, Mama. I want to make sure no one feels alone when they're fighting their monsters. I smiled, my heart full. Then you'll be unstoppable, I said. Because stories are how we change the world. As we reached our apartment, I looked back at the path we had traveled, from the despair of that family court waiting room to the hope of this moment. I had learned that love was not just a feeling, but a force that could survive manipulation, withstand corruption, and inspire change. I had been declared unfit to be a mother, but I had become something far greater, a protector, an advocate, a storyteller, a hero in my son's eyes. The monsters were still out there, lurking in systems and shadows, but so were the fighters. And as long as there were children like Yuki, women like Miyuki, and advocates like Rei, we would keep fighting because love was worth it and justice was possible.